Picture this. It's 1810, and the Louisiana bayou is a place where shadows cling to every twisted cypress, where the air hums with secrets older than the swamps themselves. The water's still, but it hides something sinister, something that makes even the bravest travelers avoid the winding paths of St. Martin's Hollow after dark. In this forgotten corner of a young America, a series of murders shook a small town to its core. Bodies, or what was left of them, were found scattered across the bayou, torn apart with a precision that chilled the blood of anyone who dared whisper about it. They called it the Bayou Bloodbath, a name that still haunts the history books. And at the heart of it all, a family of butchers, known only as the Shadowed Butchers, whose knives carved more than just meat. Who were they? What drove them to such horrors? And why, even now, do some say the bayou still hides their secrets? Welcome to the Crime O'Clock, where we uncover the darkest tales history tried to bury. Before we dive into this chilling story, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the Crime O'Clock. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Have you heard whispers of the Bayou Bloodbath before? And if you're as gripped by this mystery as we are, smash that like button to keep the darkness coming. Now let's step into the shadows of 1810 Louisiana and unravel the terror of the Shadowed Butchers. Deep in the heart of Louisiana, where the bayou's murky waters twist through cypress knees and Spanish moss hangs like a shroud, there was a place called St. Martin's Hollow. In 1810, it was little more than a speck on the map, a trading post where trappers, merchants, and drifters crossed paths, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the faint, sour tang of decay. Folks here lived on edge, caught between the wild frontier and the whispers of something older, something darker, stirring in the swamps. They spoke of voodoo, of spirits that lingered where the water met the shadows. But in the spring of that year, a new kind of fear took root, one that didn't come from ghost stories. It started with a merchant named Elias Fournier. He was a wiry man, known for his quick smile and his wagon full of furs, passing through St. Martin's Hollow on his way to New Orleans. He'd been seen at the local tavern, sharing a drink with the locals, laughing about the gators that snapped at his boat. But the next morning, Elias was gone. His wagon sat abandoned on the edge of town, its contents untouched. Days later, a trapper stumbled across something in the bayou, a tangle of remains, barely recognizable as human. The cuts were clean, precise, like the work of someone who knew their way around a blade. The town whispered this was no accident. This was slaughter. Not long after, a fisherman named Remy Thibodeau met a similar fate. Remy was a fixture in St. Martin's Hollow, a quiet man who knew every bend of the bayou. His pirogue was found drifting, empty, save for a single oar stained with blood. His body, or parts of it, turned up a week later, scattered across a muddy bank. The cuts were unmistakable, identical to those on Elias. The townsfolk gathered at the church, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the shadows. Something was hunting them, and it wasn't an animal. At the center of St. Martin's Hollow stood the Leclerc family. Antoine Leclerc, patriarch, ran the town's only butcher shop with his wife, Marguerite, and their 3 grown sons. They were a hard-faced bunch, their aprons stained, their hands calloused from years of wielding cleavers. The Leclercs supplied meat to every household in town, their smokehouse churning out hams and sausages that kept the community fed. But there was something off about them. They kept to themselves, their shop locked tight after dusk. Locals swore they heard strange noises from the Leclerc property at night. Low chants, the clatter of metal, the occasional scream, carried on the wind. Antoine, with his cold gray eyes, brushed off questions with a smile that never reached them. "Just business," he'd say, wiping his hands on his apron. The town had a sheriff, Marcel Dubois, a man hardened by years of chasing bandits through the swamps. Marcel wasn't one for superstition, but even he felt uneasy passing the Leclerc's shop. When Elias and Remy's bodies were found, he started asking questions. The townsfolk were quick to point fingers, not at the Leclercs directly, but at the bayou itself. "It's cursed," they'd say, clutching rosaries and charms. "The spirits are angry." But Marcel saw the cuts on those bodies. He'd seen wounds like that before, back when he'd worked a slaughterhouse in Baton Rouge. This wasn't the work of spirits. This was the work of a butcher. By summer, the fear in St. Martin's Hollow was palpable. Families stopped letting their children play near the water. Travelers avoided the town altogether, spreading word of a bloodbath in the bayou. The Leclercs, though, carried on as if nothing was wrong. Their shops stayed open, their meat still sold. But whispers grew louder. A trapper claimed he'd seen Antoine rowing out into the swamp at midnight, his boat heavy with sacks that didn't look like game. A barmaid swore she'd found a bone in her stew, too long, too thin to be from any hog. And then there was the smell, faint but persistent, drifting from the Leclerc smokehouse. It wasn't the usual smoky sweetness of curing meat. It was something fouler, something that turned the stomach. Marcel Dubois didn't have proof, not yet, but he watched the Leclercs closely, noting how they never seemed shaken by the murders, how their shop never ran short of meat, even as game grew scarce in the bayou. The townsfolk needed the Leclercs. They were the only butchers for miles. But Marcel couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to the Bayou Bloodbath lay behind their locked doors, in the shadows where their knives gleamed. And as the summer heat thickened, the killings didn't stop. They got worse. By the fall of 1810, St. Martin's Hollow was a town under siege, not by an army, but by fear. The Bayou Bloodbath had claimed more than just Elias Fournier and Remy Thibodeau. A young couple, newlyweds headed to New Orleans, vanished after stopping in town for supplies. Their horse was found tied to a tree, saddlebags untouched, but their bodies, or what remained, turned up days later, deep in the swamp. The cuts were cleaner now, almost surgical, as if the killer was perfecting their craft. Then there was Celeste, a voodoo priestess who'd lived on the edge of the bayou for years. She was known for her charms, her warnings about spirits that demanded respect. When her shack was found empty, her altar smashed, and her remains scattered like offerings, the town's whispers turned to screams. These weren't random killings. They felt deliberate, like a message written in blood. Sheriff Marcel Dubois was drowning in questions with no answers. The townsfolk of St. Martin's Hollow were too scared to help, too dependent on the Leclerc family's butcher's shop to point fingers. Antoine Leclerc and his kin were untouchable, their smiles sharp as their blades. Marcel tried questioning them, but Antoine was slick, his answers vague. "Folks go missing in the bayou," he'd say, leaning on his counter, his sons watching from the shadows. Marguerite, his wife, was quieter, her eyes darting to the back of the shop whenever Marcel lingered too long. The sheriff knew they were hiding something, but without evidence. His hands were tied. Then came a break, small but promising. A boy, barely 12, was caught stealing apples from the Leclerc's yard. When Marcel hauled him in, the kid was shaking, not from the theft but from what he'd seen. He swore he'd peeked through a crack in the Leclerc smokehouse wall and glimpsed a ledger, pages filled with names, dates, and words like special delivery. The boy couldn't read well, but he knew the book wasn't for pork or venison. Marcel didn't have a warrant, didn't have the manpower to storm the Leclerc's property, but he started watching their shop closer. He noticed wagons leaving at odd hours, always headed toward the swamp, always returning empty before dawn. The townsfolk weren't much help. Fear had them clutching their rosaries, muttering about curses and spirits. Some swore the Leclercs were in league with a bayou demon, a Loa that demanded blood for power. Others whispered about voodoo, pointing to Celeste's death as proof the priestess had crossed someone, or something, too dangerous. But Marcel wasn't buying the supernatural talk. He'd seen enough of human cruelty to know evil didn't need spirits to thrive. Still, he couldn't ignore the strange symbols carved into trees near the crime scenes, spirals and crosses, etched deep like markers. They weren't random vandalism. They meant something, and Marcel needed someone who could read them. That's when he turned to Lisette, a young woman who'd studied under Celeste. Lisette was no priestess, but she knew the old ways, the signs and stories of the bayou. She was reluctant, scared of crossing the Leclercs, but Marcel convinced her to help. She studied the symbols and paled. They weren't voodoo, not exactly, but something older, tied to Creole tales of blood offerings for wealth and influence. Lizette warned Marcel to tread carefully. "Whoever's doing this," she whispered, "they're not just killing, they're trading." Trading what? She wouldn't say, not yet. The killings didn't stop. A drifter, then a local farmer, then a teenage girl who'd gone to pick herbs by the water. Each time, the bodies were found in pieces, the cuts precise, the remains arranged almost ritualistically. The town was unraveling. Families barred their doors at night. The tavern emptied early. Even the church stopped holding evening services. Marcel felt the pressure mounting. Angry townsfolk demanding answers, his own doubts gnawing at him. He started tailing the Leclercs' wagons, creeping through the swamp under moonlight. One night, he saw Antoine himself, rowing a pirogue loaded with heavy sacks, their contents leaking a dark, viscous trail into the water. Marcel followed, but the bayou was a maze, and Antoine vanished into the fog. Back in town, the whispers grew darker. A hunter claimed he'd found a pile of bones in the swamp, too many to belong to one person, hidden under a tarp near the Leclercs' usual route. A seamstress swore she'd seen Marguerite burning blood-soaked rags behind the shop. And that smell from the smokehouse, it was stronger now, seeping into the streets. A rancid stench that no amount of curing meat could explain. Marcel knew he was close, but the Leclercs were careful, their secrets locked tighter than their shop doors. He needed hard evidence, something to break their hold on St. Martin's Hollow. But the deeper he dug, the more he felt the bayou watching, waiting, as if it were guarding the truth, and the shadowed butchers itself. As winter crept into St. Martin's Hollow in 1810, the bayou seemed to tighten its grip on the town. The air grew heavy, the fog thicker, and the killings more brazen. The Bayou Bloodbath had left a trail of broken families and unanswered questions, and Sheriff Marcel Dubois was running out of time. The townsfolk were on the verge of revolt, some demanding he arrest the Leclercs, others begging him to leave the butchers alone, terrified of what might happen if their meat supply, or worse, their protection, ran dry. But Marcel had seen too much. The ledger, the symbols, the blood trail in the swamp. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was chasing monsters. Lizette, the young apprentice of the slain voodoo priestess Celeste, became Marcel's key to unlocking the mystery. She spent nights poring over the symbols found near the crime scenes, cross-referencing them with old Creole stories her mentor had taught her. What she found wasn't voodoo, not in the way the townsfolk thought. The carvings told a darker tale, one of blood offerings to secure power, wealth, maybe even immortality. "It's a contract," Lizette said, her voice trembling. "They're giving blood to something or someone for a price." She wouldn't meet Marcel's eyes when he pressed her for more, but she pointed him to the Leclerc smokehouse. "Whatever they're hiding," she whispered, "it's in there." Marcel gathered what little help he could, a handful of trappers brave or desperate enough to defy the Leclercs. Under cover of night, they surrounded the butcher shop, its windows dark, the air thick with that sickly, rotting stench. The lock on the smokehouse was heavy, but a crowbar and a few tense minutes got them inside. What they found turned Marcel's stomach. Hidden behind a false wall was a chamber, its floor slick with blood, its shelves lined with tools, cleavers, hooks, saws, caked in something far worse than animal gore. There were bones, too, stacked neatly in crates, some small enough to belong to children. And there, on a table, was the ledger the boy had described, its pages filled with names, dates, and payments to buyers listed only by initials. These weren't orders for pork or venison. The Leclercs were selling something far more sinister. The truth hit Marcel like a blow. The shadowed butchers weren't just killers. They were running a trade, carving up their victims and shipping the remains to buyers across Louisiana, maybe beyond. For what? Rituals? Profit? Some unholy mix of both? The ledger hinted a network, a web of dealers who paid handsomely for special deliveries. Marcel's men found sacks ready for transport, their contents too gruesome to name. But Antoine Leclerc, the patriarch, was nowhere to be found. His wife, Marguerite, and their son stood silent, their faces unreadable, as Marcel clapped them in irons. They didn't resist, didn't speak. It was as if they knew something he didn't. Word of the raid spread, and the town descended into chaos. Some cheered Marcel's name, others cursed him, convinced he'd doomed them all by crossing the Leclercs. But Marcel wasn't done. Antoine was still out there, and the sheriff knew the bayou was his hiding place. With Lizette's help, he tracked the patriarch's trail, following the faint marks of a pirogue through the swamp's labyrinth. The air grew colder, the water blacker, and strange noises echoed, whispers, splashes, things moving just out of sight. Lisette clutched a charm, muttering prayers, but Marcel pushed on, his lantern barely cutting through the fog. They found Antoine's boat abandoned, its hull stained with blood. Nearby, half sunk in the mud, was a sack with a single sheet of paper inside. The note was scrawled in Antoine's hand. The work continues. The bayou keeps its own. Marcel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The swamp seemed alive, its shadows shifting, its silence mocking him. Lisette urged him to turn back, whispering of spirits that guarded their own. But Marcel pressed deeper, determined to end it. That's when the traps began. Ropes strung across the water, spikes hidden in the mud. One caught a trapper, his scream swallowed by the night. Then, in a clearing, they saw it. A circle of those same carved symbols, surrounding a pile of fresh bones. Antoine was gone, vanished into the bayou like a ghost. Some say he drowned, claimed by the swamp he'd fed with blood. Others say he escaped, slipping away to join others like him, butchers who traded in flesh and secrets. Marcel never found him. The sheriff returned to St. Martin's Hollow, the note clutched in his hand, his face aged beyond his years. The Leclerc's shop was burned to the ground by the townsfolk, but the fear lingered. The ledger was locked away, its contents too horrific to share. And the bayou, it stayed silent, keeping its secrets, as if waiting for the next offering. In the years that followed, St. Martin's Hollow never recovered. Families left, the trading post dwindled, and the bayou reclaimed what was left. The Bayou Bloodbath became a legend, whispered by travelers and elders, a cautionary tale of what lurks in the shadows of the swamp. Marguerite and her sons were tried, but their silence held firm. No confessions, no explanations. They were sent to a prison in New Orleans, where they faded from history. The ledger, some say, was destroyed, though others claim it's hidden still, locked in a vault, its list of buyers a secret too dangerous to reveal. And Antoine, his fate remains a mystery. The bayou doesn't give up its dead, and it doesn't tell tales. Looking back, the Bayou Bloodbath fits the lawless chaos of 1810 Louisiana, a time when the frontier was wild, and justice was as murky as the swamp itself. The mix of cultures, French, Spanish, Creole, bred stories of voodoo and spirits, but the truth was uglier. The Leclercs weren't possessed by demons or guided by Loa. They were human, driven by greed, power, or something even darker. Yet the questions linger. Who were those buyers in the ledger? How far did their network stretch? And what did Antoine mean when he wrote? The work continues. Even now, some say the bayou holds the answers, waiting for those foolish enough to seek them. That's the story of the Shadowed Butchers, a tale of blood, secrets, and a town that learned to fear the dark. What do you think, Crime O'Clock viewers? Was Antoine Leclerc a monster, or just one piece of a larger horror? Drop your theories in the comments below, and let us know if you've heard other whispers of the Bayou Bloodbath. If this story chilled you to the bone, give us a like and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. And stick around, our next tale is already brewing, darker and stranger than ever. This is the Crime O'Clock, signing off until the clock strikes again.